I wanted to take a second to show you what some quality conclusion statements might look like in your lab report. This particular paragraph is an extension, or it's a next steps paragraph from somebody's lab assignment. And I think overall it's really well done. Let me show you some things that I look for in this section of the report. One of the first things that I look for is whether or not the next steps that people list are related to the current activity. Lots of times people will have next steps, but they're not necessarily related to the activity that you are working on. This particular assignment asked you to experiment with density, and you'll notice that both of these questions are related to density. The author first asks whether or not the amount of food coloring will make a difference in the density of the liquids. The second question asks whether or not pouring the fresh water into the salt water, instead of the other way around, will make a difference. Because both of those activities are related to density, they're rock-solid answers. This author has also done something else that's rock-solid. Not only have they given us a new question that they would like the answer to, but they've also made a prediction about what they think will happen in both cases. Lots of times people have been listing for me really good and interesting questions, but then not telling us what they think will happen. In this particular case, the author believes that additional food coloring really won't make that much of a difference. The author also believes that pouring the fresh water into the salt water won't make a difference either. They believe that the salt water, because it's more dense, will still make its way to the bottom of the beaker. It's really important whenever you are explaining a question that you have, that you also give what you think the answer will be too. It's kind of like in math when you're trying to show your work. Now, there's a few things that I think should be done differently with this paragraph. First of all, and probably most importantly, I don't really like how the sentences are organized. In this case, the author has listed all of their questions in the yellow sentences, and then they put their predictions in the green and purple sentences. I think it might work better if we move the predictions right behind the questions that they answer, only because that will help the reader to understand exactly what they think is going to happen, or what the author thinks is going to happen in each individual experiment. So I'm going to take a second and just move these around in the paragraph, and let's see what we have now. The way that our sentences look now, after each question is the author's prediction about what will happen. For example, look at the first one. It says, one of the things that I would like to try and test is whether or not the amount of liquid or the color of liquid made a difference. If I got a chance to test this, I think that the color would not make that much of a difference, because as long as you keep everything constant, the results should be the same. I think that sounds better, because the prediction follows the question. In the second sentence, it now says, also, if you poured the fresh water into the salt water, would the experiment work? I predict that my second test would be the same too, because just like the layers of the earth, all dense materials always sink to the bottom. To me, again, that just sounds better because the prediction follows the question. Last but not least, and kind of an interesting side effect of moving sentences around, now we happen to have a nice closing sentence too. These are some of the problems that I would like to solve. Originally, this blue sentence was hidden in the middle of the paragraph. Now it gives a nice sense of closure to the piece. So organizationally, I always think it's an important thing for you to put your prediction right after the question. Okay, a couple of other small revisions need to be made in here. First of all, when we moved our sentences around, it became important for us to change this word. Originally, using these made sense because we were talking about two different experiments. Now, we're really only talking about the first question. So we need to change this and make it say, this idea. If you read this sentence, it sounds smoother, doesn't it? If I got a chance to test this idea, I think that the color would not make that much of a difference. The author wasn't wrong to use the word these the first time, but because we reorganized our sentences, we had to do a little bit of revising. A few other things to notice. Here's a tricky word. The word weather has about a dozen different spellings. This happens to be the way that children spell it most of the time. In reality, the word weather has another H in it. Be sure to look up those tricky words. I think we talked about that in our last screencast too. Finally, here's another tricky word. Two, and two are always words that kids make little mistakes on because it's difficult to remember which word to use in which circumstance. I think the author was trying to use the TOO version of the word because it means as well. I predict that my second test would be the same as well because just like the layers of the earth. In that case, you want to use TOO. Alright, let's get some points to remember here. I'll get my red highlighter out. First point to remember. Always list your predictions after your questions. That certainly works out a little bit better organizationally. Next point to remember. Always look up tricky words. Those words like weather and to and it and there are so common that it's really important that you be sure that you've used them correctly. Overall, what did this piece get? This author in their conclusion section earned a very high 90. This particular section of the piece probably would have earned about a 93 or a 94 on its own, because it needed some small revisions. Overall, though, it's really solid because it includes lots of elaboration.